unconscious bias, we're going to look at what it is, a few different types. There's over 175 different types of cognitive bias, but we're only obviously going to look at a few of them in terms of how we work with children and young people and how it impacts on our decision making, but also how it impacts on children and young people. So this is one of the definitions of unconscious bias. Folks, you've probably seen it. There's loads of different definitions out there. I like this one by the Royal Society because it gives quite a bit of detail. So it's when we make judgments or decisions on the basis of prior experience, our own personal deep-seated thought patterns, assumptions, or interpretations, and we're not aware of that we're doing it. Yeah. There is also conscious bias, right? Some people, especially now in this day and age, ideology is changing. People are consciously biased and are owning that. So we have to be very mindful that it's not always unconscious. And here again, when the unconscious brain experiences two things occurring together, it begins to expect them to be seen together. If we think about terrorism, most of us think about a certain demographic of people. Depending, maybe in Northern Ireland, you might think about it differently. So again, it's about context, right? Because our brain sees things and hears things all the time. We hear in the news, for example, black on black crime. The Home Office in the UK, there's no such thing. Right? There's no such thing as black on black crime, just like there's no such thing as white on white crime. But we hear it enough, it starts to filter into our brain, just like we have with any of these other situations, right? And especially when we're doing risk assessments with children and young people, our unconscious bias kicks in. We have to think about concepts such as adultification, for example, where we see young people as more adult than they are. It doesn't give them the benefit of innocence, right? Which applies usually to young Black children. And we see that, and that comes from somewhere. That comes from a narrative. That comes from that ideology. And we have to own that and bring it into our conscious awareness. Because the unconscious bias impacts on how we see the world. Yeah, it's our perceptual lens because it's through norms, language, values, behaviors, and practices, yeah, within our communities. It's also around historical group learning and cultural narratives. Yeah, so experiences, stories, history, thematic beliefs. And now it's even more dangerous because we see it on social media, right? Those experiences and stories are getting shared over social media and amplified on social media. It also impacts our individual learning and the narrative that we have about the people around us, based on our own individual experience, our own trauma, our own history. And it impacts then invariably onto social and institutional learning. So patterns of historic behavior in relation to institutions, for example. So as I said earlier, there's loads of different types of unconscious bias. I think there's like 175. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all of them today, but I've picked out a couple because I think that they are really important for us to understand in the context of working with children and young people and families. Okay. So the first one, very simply, is first impressions. You know, you meet somebody and you're like, I just have a good feeling about you. Right? You don't. There is something in your brain that is calculating all the time and recognizing different aspects of this person that may have a good result or that might have a negative result. So we're built to size each other up very quickly. Even when we're presented with evidence to the contrary, we really focus on our first impressions of people. Yeah. And those can be based on a wide variety of characteristics. They can be gender, age, culture, race, language, physical appearance. And we particularly judge trustworthiness, confidence, and competence on those. So for the first impression to be challenged, we need to be aware of it, set it aside, and then look for specific evidence of trustworthiness, confidence, or competence. Then there's the concept of that stereotyping. So it's something that we all do it, right? We all do it on a daily basis, whether consciously or unconsciously. It's really just about a generalization about a person or group of people that could be both positive or negative, right? So people might associate race, ethnicity, gender, age, disability, or students with things like work, food, wealth, music, and other facets of life. So it's those assumptions that if you are a Black person, you're going to be great at dancing. Yeah. Or that Indian people are always great at making curries. Right? We know that they're just people. That doesn't always go, but it's a stereotype that we have. Affinity bias then is a really important one for us because in our brain, in the primal part of our brain, we look for people like us because people like us are safe. Okay, so it's a process called social categorization. So you look for people who are like you in some way. And when we find people who are like us in some way, we have increased empathy for them. And when people are not like us, the empathy is decreased. Okay. So affinity bias is, well, that you identify with a particular group or social group that are similar, and you feel a sense of belonging, and that's important to our growth and self-esteem. And that can then lead to that them and us mentality, right? And then we tend to magnify differences between ourselves and people who are not like us. Out groups, and exaggerate similarities between ourselves and people who have things in common with us. Yeah, and we see that in the narratives. We see that in how the media, for example, talks about the people coming over in the boats. Yeah, they're people. They're terrified people, but that's not the narrative that we get. And then that increases that them and us. I would never do that. Well, maybe you've never been in that situation before. You don't know what you would do. It's a person. They've made a choice, right? It's very difficult to think about it that way because our brain doesn't kind of allow us to do that. We need to have that differentiation. So if we believe that we don't have any unconscious biases, it just simply means that we're not aware of them. We don't think that. Conformity bias, really, really important, especially when we're making risk assessments, because conformity bias, again, it's about survival, right? So think about us when we were like back in tribal days. If you did not conform to the group, you weren't getting fed, you weren't going to have housing, and you weren't going to be safe. Conformity is a really, really important part of being a human and as a social creature. But conformity bias can be dangerous. We often conform to somebody who is the loudest or who's a leader. So if the leader is wrong and he leads us in the wrong direction, people will go. But what happens if we're risk assessing a safeguarding situation and we're deferring to somebody who has the loudest voice or who appears to be more confident than us or who has more power than us? So we have to guard against that conformity bias to just kind of go along with what everybody else is saying when your gut is like, no, this is wrong. This doesn't make sense. Selective attention is another one then that we kind of those. So this is the capacity or the process of reacting to certain stimuli selectively when several occur simultaneously. So there's several things that could be true, but you have one that you kind of hang your hat on. That's the one that you're giving more attention to. Yeah. So because at any given moment, we're subjected to a constant barrage of sensory information. But when attention is occupied with one thing, people often fail to notice other things right before their eyes. Has anybody seen that video, the monkey business one? So there's this video where they you see like a group of people, some of them in white t-shirts, some of them in black t-shirts, and the prompt is to count how many times the ball is passed between the group wearing the white t-shirts and the group wearing the black t-shirts. In the video, there's a monkey that does like a moonwalk across the thing, and most people miss it because of that selective attention. You don't see it. And then when you see it again, you're like, wow, how did I miss that? And that happens, especially as well, when we're working with risk assessments. We only focus on one thing. We're missing a whole lot of other stuff that's going on. And then priming is a really interesting one as well. Have you ever met somebody and then they say, like a friend introduces you to another friend and they're like, oh, they're really nice once you get to know them. And you're like, what does that mean? So now I'm primed to look for them doing something out of pocket, right? I'm waiting for them to do something weird so that I'm like, oh, that's why the warning was there. I'm primed down to look for that behavior. Yeah. So if we're working with a new family, or if we're working with a new young person and we're told, terrible family to work with, really difficult kid, we're ready. We're primed. Yeah. For that child to be difficult. And then the final one is performance. Yeah. So performance bias is a tendency to, very often this comes into play in terms of gender imbalances. So the tendency to underestimate a woman's performance and overestimate a man's. So there was like, and many of you will hear this. So like studies of identical CVs, one with a man's name and one with a woman's name, found that 79% of applicants with a man's name versus only 49% of those with a woman's name were worthy of hire. When you add an ethnicity to that, the differentiation is even bigger. Yeah, same CV. So how does bias affect our actions? Lots of different ways. Yeah. It's in our perception. It's how we see people and perceive reality. It is that powerful. When we think of people who have very strong anti-immigration or or racist ideologies, they feel that that is their reality, right? And their perception. It impacts how we react towards certain groups of people. It impacts on our behavior, how friendly or receptive we are to them. It also impacts on our attention. Which aspects of a person do we pay most attention to? We also actively listen to what certain people say because we want to be confirmed in our bias. Yeah. But it can also be in micro affirmation. So how much or how little we comfort certain people in certain situations. So again, that goes back to that affinity bias. If somebody is like me, I will have more sympathy and empathy with them. How are we doing for time? Okay. So the impact on making decisions is the blind spot theory. So this is the bias blind spot. Blind spot. It's a blog unveiling the hidden influence in sports. And one of the impacts is that we're overconfident in our objectivity. Yeah. So we're not aware, obviously, of the blind spot. So we're not aware that we are capable of making biased judgments. That's why talking to your colleagues is always so important, right? And having that discussion. And we also underestimate personal bias and where they sit and how they rear their heads. And that's why this conversation very often around unconscious bias or anti-racism can be challenging, because we'll constantly have to think about ourselves. How do I see the world? What assumptions do I make about people? And some of the answers to those questions might not be very nice, right? But we have to own that if we want to do the work. So when we talk about unconscious bias in sport, and I've titled it this way because some of the bias is very conscious, right? So it can impact on player evaluations and recruitment. So coaches and scouts may unknowingly allow bias to influence their evaluations of players, and this can result in racial or gender stereotyping and then affecting decisions about players' abilities, and that can lead to then unequal opportunities. So in 2004, for example, several football clubs were criticized for their recruitment practices, where Black and brown players were often overlooked in favor of white counterparts despite having similar or better performance. And this bias in player evaluations led to fewer opportunities for minority players to showcase their talents. We can also see it in referee decisions. So obviously referees, human beings too, and officials can be subject to unconscious bias, and that can then impact their ability to make fair and impartial decisions. Biases related to players' identity, team reputation, or fan dynamics can inadvertently influence their judgments. So during the 2025 World Cup, there were several instances where referees' decisions were questioned for potential bias, and studies indicate that referees were more likely to penalize players from minority backgrounds for similar infractions compared to their white peers. Other places, media and fans. Sports media coverage often reflects unconscious bias. Journalists and commentators may unintentionally perpetuate those stereotypes. We've seen in any of my past presentations the way, for example, people talked about Serena Williams or Lewis Hamilton, for example, within their sports. And into 2024, the media coverage of the Women's Football World Cup highlighted a lot of unconscious bias as well. So female athletes' achievements were often downplayed or described using different terms compared to male athletes. For example, aggressive plays by male athletes were praised, and similar actions by female athletes were labeled as emotional. Right. So we have very different language for the same thing. Yeah. So again, language and commentary as well, in terms of how do we speak about the athletes that we see? How does the media speak about them? How do we talk about them? And what does that commentary say about how we feel about those sports people?